The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield of Michael's sleek black Tesla as he navigated through the partially flooded streets of downtown Seattle. The wipers swished back and forth with an almost hypnotic rhythm, barely keeping up with the torrent. Outside, the city seemed cloaked in a dreary shroud of gray, the streetlights casting long, blurry reflections on the wet asphalt. Michael adjusted the heat inside his car, the luxury of comfort contrasting sharply with the chaos unfolding just beyond his tinted windows. Michael was a man of precision. His tailored gray suit, albeit now slightly rumpled after a long day of meetings, spoke volumes about his life, controlled, sharp, and detached. His success as a tech entrepreneur had placed him in the upper echelons of Seattle society. Yet, tonight, there was an unfamiliar unease gnawing at him. The weather had turned what was supposed to be a smooth drive home into a labyrinth of detours and gridlocks. Frustration bubbled within him as he gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. Then he saw her. Through the blur of rain and the glare of his headlights, a figure emerged. A woman, drenched to the bone, was frantically trying to shield two small children under a flimsy, torn umbrella. Beside her, a golden retriever wagged its wet tail, its fur matted from the downpour. Michael instinctively slowed his car. "Mom, I'm cold," a small voice cried, audible even through the layers of rain and glass. Michael rolled down his window slightly, the cold, wet air instantly rushing in. "Hey, do you need help?" he called out, his voice hesitant. The woman turned toward him, her face pale and weary under the dim streetlights. Her hair was plastered to her head, strands sticking awkwardly to her cheeks. She hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. Strangers offering help on a stormy night weren't always what they seemed. "No, we're fine," she replied, her voice firm but trembling slightly. "Fine? You're soaked, and those kids look freezing. Let me give you a ride," Michael insisted, leaning slightly out of the car. His tone wasn't commanding but carried a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. The older child clung to her leg, shivering visibly, while the younger one, barely 3, whimpered in her arms. The dog let out a soft bark, as if trying to say something in agreement. Her maternal instincts wrestled with her caution. Finally, she nodded, more out of desperation than trust. "Okay, but just to somewhere dry," she said, her voice cracking. Michael stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through his jacket. He opened the rear door, gesturing for them to climb in. "Come on. It's warm inside." The children hesitated but followed their mother's lead, huddling into the back seat. The dog hesitated briefly, its loyalty making it unsure of the man. Michael crouched down, meeting the animal's gaze. "You too, buddy," he said, patting his thigh. The golden retriever jumped in, shaking water everywhere. As Michael slid back into the driver's seat, the woman's voice cut through the tension. "Thank you. I'm Sarah, and these are my kids, Liam and Sophie." "And that's Max," she said, gesturing to the dog. "Michael," he replied, his voice softer now. "Where to?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. We don't really have anywhere right now." Michael glanced at her through the rearview mirror, her exhaustion painfully evident. "All right, we'll figure it out. For now, let's get you somewhere safe and warm." The rest of the drive was filled with the soft hum of the heater and occasional whispers from the children. As Michael drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was about to change his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The Tesla's interior was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the engine and the faint pattering of raindrops against the windows. Sarah sat stiffly in the back seat, clutching her children close. Liam, the older of the two, held onto her arm tightly, his wide eyes darting nervously between his mother and Michael. Sophie, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, snuggled into her mother's chest, her small body finally beginning to relax in the warmth of the car. Max, the loyal golden retriever, sat calmly on the floor, his big brown eyes occasionally glancing up at Michael, as if assessing him. Michael glanced in the rearview mirror. The tension in the air was palpable. He wanted to say something to ease it, but words felt insufficient. So, he began, keeping his tone light. Do you have a place in mind? Maybe a shelter, or… Sarah's face tightened. I don't know. We've been moving around a lot. Most places are full. And her voice trailed off, and she bit her lip as if trying to hold back tears. Michael hesitated before responding. He wasn't used to this kind of situation. He wasn't even sure why he had stopped. But there was something about Sarah's desperation, the fragility of her children, and the quiet dignity in the way she carried herself that struck a chord deep within him. Well, he said, choosing his words carefully, I have a house outside the city. It's big, and there's more than enough room for a few guests. Just for tonight, until we figure something out. Sarah's eyes snapped to him, sharp with suspicion. Why would you do that? You don't even know us. Michael exhaled, gripping the wheel a little tighter. You're right, I don't. But I can see you need help, and I can help. That's it. No strings attached. Her eyes narrowed, scanning his face for any sign of deceit. People don't just offer strangers a place to stay. Not without wanting something in return. Michael met her gaze in the mirror, his expression steady. I'm not people. And like I said, no strings. But it's your choice. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She turned to Liam, smoothing his damp hair, and then kissed Sophie's forehead. She glanced at Max, who gave a small, reassuring bark, as if to say, it's okay, trust him. Finally, she nodded. All right, just for tonight. Michael nodded, his face betraying no emotion, though a flicker of relief passed through him. Okay, let's get out of this rain. The drive to Michael's house was quiet. Sarah remained vigilant, her eyes scanning the surroundings as they left the crowded streets of downtown Seattle and moved toward the quieter suburbs. Michael's home came into view, an architectural marvel of glass and wood, perched on a hill overlooking the city. It was modern and imposing, yet the soft lighting spilling from the windows gave it an oddly welcoming warmth. Wow, Liam whispered, his face pressed to the window. It was the first time he'd spoken since getting into the car. Michael smiled faintly. Yeah, it's a bit much, he admitted as he parked the car in the spacious garage. He stepped out first, opening the back door for Sarah and the kids. Come on, let's get you inside. The foyer was expansive, with high ceilings and polished hardwood floors that gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. A large fireplace roared to life in the living room, activated by a discreet switch on the wall. The warmth was immediate, and Sarah visibly relaxed as the children gravitated toward the fire, their small hands outstretched. Wow, Liam said again, his voice tinged with awe this time. Max padded over to the hearth, lying down with a contented sigh. Let me grab some towels, Michael offered, disappearing down a hallway. He returned moments later with fluffy white towels, handing one to each of them. Dry off, and I'll see if I have anything for the kids to wear. Probably a little big, but better than staying wet. Thank you, Sarah said quietly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and hesitation. She wrapped a towel around Sophie, who giggled at the softness, then handed one to Liam. Michael watched from the kitchen, his hands gripping the countertop. Something about this moment felt strange, like he was watching a scene from someone else's life. He shook off the thought and turned back toward Sarah. Make yourselves at home, he said. I'll put on some coffee. And there's plenty of food if you're hungry. Sarah glanced at him, her guard still up. You've already done enough. Michael's gaze softened. It's nothing. Really? As Sarah watched him disappear into the kitchen, her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for: safety. As the comforting warmth of the fireplace enveloped them, Sarah's initial tension began to ebb. The children, now dressed in oversized sweatshirts Michael had found in his closet, sat cross-legged on the plush living room rug, nibbling on crackers he had brought from the kitchen. Max had curled up beside them, his head resting on his paws, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor. Michael leaned against the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He had already changed into a casual sweater and jeans, his business persona stripped away for the evening. With a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, he hesitated before stepping into the room. "You look like you could use one of these," he said, holding out a second mug to Sarah, who was seated on the edge of the sofa. She hesitated, then took it. "Thanks," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it. Michael sat in the armchair across from her, keeping a comfortable distance. He could sense her guardedness, an invisible barrier that refused to drop even in the safety of his home. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them. "You don't have to stay up, you know," Sarah finally said, her voice tentative. "You've already done so much." Michael shook his head. "I don't mind. Besides, I think you could use someone to talk to." She stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Talk about what?" Michael leaned back, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. "Whatever you want. Or nothing at all. But you've been through a lot, haven't you?" Sarah's eyes flicked to her children, who were now engrossed in a quiet game with Max. She sighed, the weight of her exhaustion pressing down on her. "It's a long story," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got time," Michael replied gently. For a moment, she seemed to debate with herself. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words began to spill out. "My ex-husband," she began, her voice tight, "wasn't always like he is now. When we first met, he was kind, hardworking. We had dreams, building a life, raising a family. But things changed. He started drinking. Then came the anger, the control." Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "When I finally got the courage to leave, he made sure I paid for it. He took everything, the house, the car, our savings. I couldn't even fight back. The system, it's not exactly built for people like me." She paused, glancing at Michael as if expecting judgment, but his expression remained neutral, encouraging. "I try to get a job, but it's hard when you've been out of the workforce for years, raising kids. And then there's Mac." She gestured to the dog, who perked up at the sound of his name. "He's part of our family, but not everyone understands that. Some shelters don't allow pets. So, we've been moving from place to place, trying to get by." Her voice cracked, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. "I don't want my kids to see me like this," she said, almost to herself. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been carrying this alone for a long time," he said softly. "That takes strength. More than most people have." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "I feel like I'm failing them." "You're not," Michael said firmly. "You're protecting them. That's what matters." For the first time, Sarah allowed herself a small, hesitant smile. "I don't even know why I'm telling you all this," she said, shaking her head. "You're a stranger." Michael shrugged. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger. No expectations, no judgment." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe you're right." As the fire crackled softly, Michael felt a pang of something unfamiliar, an urge to do more than just listen. But he knew this wasn't the moment to make promises or offer solutions. Sarah needed space, not pressure. "Let's get through tonight," he said gently. "One step at a time." Sarah nodded, her shoulders sagging as if a small weight had been lifted. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Michael gave her a faint smile. "It's nothing. Get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." As Sarah settled onto the sofa, pulling a blanket over herself, Michael stood and walked back to his room. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of her weary face or the quiet strength in her voice. Something about this woman and her children had awakened a part of him he didn't even know existed. Michael woke early the next morning, the gray Seattle sky casting a muted light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his bedroom. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts clouded with the previous night's revelations. Sarah's story had stirred something deep within him, a quiet discomfort that had refused to fade, even in sleep. He showered and dressed in casual clothes, a simple sweater and jeans, before heading downstairs. The house was unusually quiet, save for the occasional patter of Max's paws against the hardwood floor. He found Sarah in the kitchen, pouring cereal into bowls for Liam and Sophie. Her face was still pale, her eyes shadowed from lack of rest, but there was a calmness in her movements that hadn't been there the night before. "Morning," Michael said softly, not wanting to startle her. Sarah turned, offering him a tentative smile. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind. I found the cereal in the pantry. The kids were hungry." "Of course not," Michael replied, waving off her concern. "Help yourselves to anything. That's what it's there for." Liam and Sophie were seated at the kitchen island, their small figures dwarfed by the high stools. They ate quietly, their gazes flicking occasionally to Michael with a mix of curiosity and shyness. Max sat at their feet, ever the faithful companion, his eyes trained on any crumbs that might fall. As Sarah joined the children, Michael busied himself with the coffee maker, the familiar routine giving him a moment to collect his thoughts. He needed to ask questions, to understand more, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. "Sarah," he began, leaning against the counter with his coffee in hand. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night." She froze slightly, her hand pausing mid-air as she handed a napkin to Sophie. "What about it?" she asked, her tone cautious. Michael took a breath. "About your ex, the struggles you've been through, and what I can do to help." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Michael, I appreciate what you've done already, but I'm not looking for a handout." "It's not a handout," he said quickly, his tone steady but firm. "It's about making things right." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated. He hadn't planned on revealing this so soon, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Sarah's story, something uncomfortably close to his own world. "I looked into a few things last night," he admitted, his voice low. "You said your ex left you with nothing, and I wanted to understand more about your situation. It turns out you worked for one of my family's companies a few years ago." Sarah's face went pale. She set the cereal box down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of frustration breaking through his composed demeanor. "And I found out you were let go during a mass layoff. But digging deeper, it looks like your position was one of the first on the chopping block. It wasn't just budget cuts, it was personal. They targeted employees with dependents, people who were seen as high risk." Sarah's jaw clenched, her expression a mix of anger and humiliation. "So what? You're here to apologize for your family's mistakes? That doesn't change anything." "I know it doesn't," Michael said, his voice rising slightly. "But it doesn't mean I can't try to make amends." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can just throw money at me and fix this? That's not how it works." Her outburst startled the children, and Liam reached for her hand, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah immediately softened, crouching down to comfort him. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing his hair back. "Mommy's just upset." Michael watched the scene unfold, guilt twisting in his gut. "I'm not trying to throw money at you," he said quietly. "I'm trying to take responsibility for something my family ignored. If I don't, who will?" Sarah stood again, her gaze locking with his. For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant sound of rain against the windows. "I don't trust you," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't trust anyone who comes from that world." Michael nodded, accepting her words without argument. "You don't have to trust me right now, but at least let me prove I'm not like them." Sarah hesitated, her defenses wavering. "Why do you even care?" she whispered. Michael looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, then back at her. Because I've spent my entire life pretending I didn't have to. And maybe it's time I stopped. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in Michael's eyes, something raw and honest that made her pause. She didn't respond, but the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the beginning of something fragile yet undeniable, a connection. The tension in the room lingered, but it was broken by the soft padding of Max's paws as he crossed the room, tail wagging. The golden retriever nudged Sarah's hand gently, his large brown eyes full of quiet understanding. Sarah sighed, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. Max seems to like you, Michael said, his voice softer now. He's a good judge of character, Sarah replied curtly, though there was a faint hint of warmth in her tone. Michael chuckled faintly. Well, I guess that's a good sign. Max wagged his tail harder, stepping closer to Michael and nudging his leg. It was almost as if the dog was extending an olive branch on Sarah's behalf. Michael crouched down, holding out his hand. Hey, buddy. Max sniffed cautiously before leaning in, allowing Michael to scratch the top of his head. Liam, encouraged by the sight, slid off his stool and sat next to Max. Max likes everybody, Liam said, looking up at Michael. His voice was small, but carried a certain innocence that broke the tension. Everybody except mean people, Sophie chimed in from her seat, still clutching her cereal bowl. Michael smiled, glancing between the children. Well, I'll do my best to stay on his good side. For a moment, the room felt lighter. Max had a way of bridging the gap between people, his gentle demeanor disarming even the hardest of hearts. Michael couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for the dog, and for Sarah, who clearly had poured so much love into him despite her hardships. As the children began to giggle at Max's antics, Sarah sat back in her chair, watching them. Her gaze softened, the weight of her burdens momentarily lifted by the sight of her children laughing. Max wasn't always like this, she said suddenly, her voice quieter now. Michael glanced up, intrigued. What do you mean? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. We got him when he was just a puppy. My ex brought him home one day, back when things were better. Max was shy, scared of loud noises. The kids loved him right away, though, and he became part of the family. Her expression darkened slightly. When things went bad, he was the one constant. No matter how loud the fights got, or how bad things were, Max stayed with us. He protected us. Michael leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Protected you how? There was a night. Sarah paused, her voice faltering. My ex came home drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He started yelling, throwing things. Max put himself between us. He growled, really growled, for the first time. My ex backed off, just for a moment, but it gave me enough time to get the kids and leave. Michael's jaw tightened, his hands clenching slightly. That's brave. For both of you. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on Max. He's more than just a dog to us. He's family. The room fell quiet again. The only sound the rain outside and the crackling of the fireplace. Michael's mind raced, processing what Sarah had shared. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for Sarah and the kids, but for Max, the unspoken hero who had held their fragile world together. I think Max is smarter than most people I know, Michael said finally, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah smirked faintly, her first genuine smile since she'd arrived. He probably is. Liam and Sophie, emboldened by the adults' softened tones, began playing with Max more animatedly. The dog barked once, a joyful sound, and wagged his tail furiously as Sophie tried to drape a blanket over him like a cape. Michael watched the scene unfold, a strange warmth spreading through him. He'd spent so much of his life chasing success, filling his days with meetings and transactions, yet this simple moment, a dog playing with kids, laughter echoing through the room, felt more meaningful than anything he could remember. As the morning stretched on, the house began to feel less like an architectural marvel and more like a home. Max continued to move between Michael and Sarah, a bridge between two worlds that had, for a brief moment, found common ground. Later that afternoon, as the rain outside slowed to a light drizzle, the house settled into a calm stillness. Sophie and Liam had fallen asleep on the couch, nestled under a blanket with Max sprawled protectively at their feet. The warmth of the fireplace flickered softly, casting golden light across the room. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of an empty coffee mug. Michael sat across from her, his laptop open but untouched. The silence between them was neither uncomfortable nor tense. It felt more like the calm before a difficult conversation. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I can't stay here forever." Michael looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. "I didn't expect you to." She glanced at him, searching for any hint of judgment, but his face betrayed none. "I need to figure out our next steps," she continued, her voice firmer now. "Find a job, a place to live, somewhere we can start fresh." Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms loosely. "Do you have any leads? Somewhere you want to start looking?" Sarah hesitated. "I used to work in admin, but it's been years. Most places won't even look at my resume, and the ones that do," she trailed off, her frustration evident. Michael's brow furrowed. "Have you thought about reaching out to local organizations? There are nonprofits that help with job placement, especially for people in situations like yours." "I have," Sarah admitted, her tone sharp. "But it's not that simple. Most of them have waiting lists, and even if I get in, it's still months before I can get enough savings for a place." Michael nodded, sensing the depth of her frustration. "What about family? Friends?" Sarah shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No one I can count on. My parents passed a few years ago, and the friends I had, well, they disappeared when things got tough." Michael didn't push further. He could see the weight of her isolation, how deeply it had shaped her determination to move forward on her own. But he also saw the exhaustion behind her strength. "What kind of job are you looking for?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. "Anything," Sarah said quickly. "I'm not picky. Admin work, retail, cleaning, whatever it takes to keep a roof over our heads." Michael hesitated, considering his words carefully. "I might know a few people, businesses that are hiring." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't need a favor, Michael." "It's not a favor," he said evenly. "It's a connection. Everyone needs one. You're good at what you do, right?" She nodded reluctantly. Yeah. "Then let me help," Michael said. "Not because I feel sorry for you, but because you're capable. And if someone in my network can see that, it's a win for everyone." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her defenses still firmly in place. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Michael replied, leaning forward slightly. "I know how the world works, Sarah. Sometimes, people just need a door to open. That's it." Sarah looked away, her gaze fixed on the window as raindrops trickled down the glass. She wanted to believe him, but trust didn't come easily, especially not with men like Michael, whose lives were worlds apart from hers. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice measured. Michael nodded, sensing that pushing further would only make her retreat. "Fair enough." As the conversation paused, Sarah glanced back toward the living room, where her children slept soundly. Her expression softened, and she exhaled slowly. "I just want them to have a normal life," she murmured. "A safe home, friends, school, things other kids take for granted." Michael followed her gaze, his chest tightening at the sight of the two small figures curled up together. "They deserve that," he said quietly. "And so do you." Sarah looked back at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. As the rain outside faded into a gentle mist, Sarah allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. "If you can really help me get on my feet," she said cautiously, "I'll consider it. But only if it's on my terms." Michael smiled faintly, appreciating her resolve. "Deal." The tentative agreement hung between them, an unspoken understanding that this was just the beginning. For the first time in years, Sarah felt as though she might be able to stop running and start rebuilding. Not because someone else was saving her, but because she was reclaiming her strength. The next morning, sunlight broke through the gray Seattle clouds, casting a soft glow over the house. It was a rare reprieve from the usual gloom. But inside Michael's home, the atmosphere remained heavy. After their quiet agreement the previous evening, Michael found himself consumed with curiosity and guilt. While Sarah and the children were occupied in the living room, Michael sat in his office, a sleek, minimalist space lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large wooden desk. His laptop screen glowed with the results of a search he'd initiated earlier. It had started innocently enough, a deeper dive into Sarah's employment history. He'd wanted to confirm what she had told him and see if he could identify opportunities to help. What he found, however, left him cold. Sarah had worked for one of the companies in his family's portfolio, a mid-sized logistics firm known for its efficiency and profitability. But the records revealed something darker: mass layoffs targeting employees with children, older workers, and anyone who might be considered a financial liability. The more Michael dug, the clearer it became. Sarah had been one of many sacrificed for the sake of corporate greed. His family's greed. The realization hit him hard. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For years, he had distanced himself from the day-to-day operations of his family's businesses, content to focus on his own ventures. But that distance now felt like willful ignorance. His wealth, his lifestyle, all of it was built on a foundation that had crushed people like Sarah. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He quickly minimized the screen, but Sarah had already stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Michael shook his head, gesturing for her to sit. "Not at all. What's up?" Sarah hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "I wanted to thank you for letting us stay another night, and for offering to help." Michael studied her for a moment, her guarded demeanor and the faint lines of exhaustion etched into her face. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing what he now knew. "Sarah," he began carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." Her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath. "I've been looking into your situation, your work history. I wanted to see if there were any connections I could use to help." She stiffened. And I found out that the company you worked for was one of my family's businesses." The words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Sarah's eyes widened, and then her expression hardened. "What are you saying?" Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I'm saying that what happened to you, the layoffs, the way you were treated, it wasn't random. It was policy. A policy designed to maximize profits by targeting people like you." Sarah's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. "So, your family did this to me?" Her voice was low, filled with quiet fury. Michael nodded, his throat dry. "Indirectly, yes. I wasn't involved in the decision-making, but that doesn't excuse it. I should have paid more attention. I should have known." Sarah stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "And now what? You think admitting it makes it okay? That it erases what I've been through?" "No," Michael said quickly, standing as well. "I don't. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen either. I want to fix it." "Fix it?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You can't fix this, Michael. You think a check or a job will erase the years I've spent scraping by, watching my kids go to bed hungry? You don't get it." Michael held her gaze, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in hers. "You're right. I don't get it, not fully. But I want to try. And I want to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Sarah's anger faltered for a moment, replaced by uncertainty. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Because I should have cared sooner," Michael admitted. "Because I've spent my life benefiting from a system that hurts people like you. And because you deserve better." Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Michael thought she might walk out. But then she crossed her arms, her stance still defensive but less rigid. "You want to help?" she said finally. "Then don't just make promises. Show me." Michael nodded, relief washing over him. "I will. Whatever it takes." As Sarah left the office, Michael sat back down, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about confronting a legacy of harm and finding a way to build something better. Michael sat in his office long after Sarah left, staring at the spreadsheets and reports that now felt like a damning indictment of his family's empire. The numbers were cold, impersonal: profits, losses, efficiency ratings. But behind them were stories like Sarah's. For the first time, he couldn't detach himself from the consequences of those numbers. Later, he joined Sarah in the living room, where Liam and Sophie were busy drawing on sheets of paper spread across the coffee table. Max sat nearby, his tail wagging lazily. The children's laughter softened the tension in the air, but Michael could still feel the weight of his earlier revelation between them. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, nodding toward the chair opposite Sarah. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "Go ahead." Michael lowered himself into the chair, clasping his hands in front of him. "I want to share something with you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her posture still guarded. "What now?" He took a deep breath. "I looked into the policies that led to your layoff. The truth is, my family's business isn't just responsible for what happened to you. It's responsible for a lot of stories like yours." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you're just now realizing this?" "Yes," Michael admitted, his tone humble. "Because I've been blind to it. I've been so focused on my own success that I ignored where it came from." Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Michael hesitated. He had been asking himself the same question all day. "I've already started making calls. I can't undo what's been done, but I can push for changes, better policies, accountability, and I can make sure the people who were hurt get the support they deserve." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Support like what?" "Financial restitution, job placement programs, childcare assistance. Whatever it takes to make things right." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You think money and programs can fix everything?" "No," Michael said firmly, "but it's a start. And it's better than doing nothing." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I am," Michael said, his voice steady. "And it's not just about you. Meeting you and your kids opened my eyes. But this is bigger than us. If I have the power to change things, I have to use it." For the first time since they had met, Sarah seemed to consider the possibility that Michael's intentions were genuine. She looked over at Liam and Sophie, who were now holding up their drawings for Max to judge. Her children deserved better, and maybe, just maybe, Michael could be part of that. "What's in it for you?" she asked finally. Michael leaned back, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Peace of mind, maybe. A sense that I'm doing something that actually matters. And, honestly, I think I need this as much as you do." Sarah's gaze softened, but her guard wasn't entirely down. "I'll believe it when I see it." "That's fair," Michael replied. "You'll see it." Just then, Liam ran over, holding up a colorful drawing of Max with a cape. "Look, Mr. Michael. Max is a superhero." Michael chuckled, taking the drawing and studying it. "He definitely is. I think he's the real boss around here." Sophie giggled from the couch. "Max saves everyone." Michael glanced at Sarah, who gave a small, reluctant smile. "Yeah," he said softly. "He does." In that moment, the tension eased slightly, replaced by a tentative understanding. It wasn't forgiveness or trust, not yet, but it was a start. And for Michael, that was enough. The following morning, the soft patter of rain returned to Seattle, a familiar soundtrack that seemed to reflect the lingering uncertainty in the house. Michael stood in the kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of coffee, his thoughts preoccupied with the steps he'd mapped out the night before. Sarah entered moments later, her face still marked by skepticism but softened by exhaustion. "You're up early," she said, her voice cautious. Michael nodded. Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about. Sarah took a seat at the kitchen island, watching him. Thinking about what? Michael set his mug down, turning to face her. About how to make this right. About what comes next. For you. For the kids, and honestly, for me too. Sarah raised an eyebrow. For you. Michael took a deep breath, leaning against the counter. Sarah, I can't undo what happened to you, but I want to offer you a way forward. Something that gives you and the kids a real chance to rebuild. She folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. I'm listening. Michael straightened, his tone steady but filled with conviction. I've set up a fund for you, a safety net, enough to cover a year's worth of rent, groceries, childcare, whatever you need to get back on your feet. No strings attached. Sarah's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise. And what's the catch? There's no catch, Michael said firmly. I've also spoken to a few people I trust, and there's a job waiting for you at a nonprofit I support. It's administrative work, something I think you'd be great at. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback. A nonprofit? Yes, Michael replied. They work with families who've been through tough times, helping them get back on their feet. You'd be helping people who've been where you are now. For a moment, Sarah said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. Michael, I don't know if I can accept this. It feels like charity. It's not charity, Michael said, his voice gentle but firm. It's an opportunity, and it's something you've earned. You're not just taking care of yourself. You're raising two incredible kids and doing everything you can to give them a better life. That's not charity, Sarah. That's strength. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the countertop. What if I can't do it? What if I mess it up? You won't, Michael said confidently. And even if you stumble, that's okay. That's part of the process. You don't have to do this alone. Sarah's throat tightened, the weight of her pride and her desperation warring within her. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. If I do this, it's on my terms. I want to earn everything, not just take what's handed to me. Michael smiled faintly, nodding. I wouldn't expect anything less. Just then, Liam and Sophie wandered into the kitchen, still groggy from sleep. Max followed close behind, his tail wagging as he nudged Sarah's leg. Sophie climbed into Sarah's lap, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck. Mommy, are we staying here forever? Sophie asked, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah hesitated, glancing at Michael before answering. No, sweetie. Just until we figure out our new home. Michael crouched down to Sophie's level, meeting her wide eyes. But you'll always have a place to visit, he said warmly. Max wouldn't want it any other way. Sophie giggled, her earlier worries forgotten, and Liam joined in. Petting Max, Sarah watched them, her heart tightening at the thought of finally having a way forward. She turned back to Michael, her voice quiet but firm. Okay, I'll take the job, but I meant what I said. I'm not taking anything I can't earn. Michael nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. Deal. And I'll be here to help, whenever you need it. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't full of hope yet, but it was a step in that direction. And for Michael, that was enough to believe that this was only the beginning of something better, for both of them. The days that followed were a whirlwind of small but significant steps forward. Michael helped Sarah finalize her paperwork for the job at the nonprofit, while she worked tirelessly to organize a plan for her family's future. Each day felt like an incremental climb out of the darkness that had once enveloped her life. The nonprofit, a local organization focused on providing support for families in crisis, welcomed Sarah warmly. On her first day, she walked into the office with her head held high, dressed in professional clothes that Michael had quietly arranged for her to purchase. The work was familiar, and though she was nervous, Sarah soon found herself falling into a rhythm. Her co-workers were kind, and for the first time in years, she felt valued for her skills. Meanwhile, the children adjusted to their new routines. Liam and Sophie had started attending a local school, and although it took time for them to settle, their laughter grew freer with each passing day. Max became a fixture in their mornings, escorting them to the door as if personally ensuring their safety. Michael, too, was changing. Inspired by Sarah's determination, he began reevaluating his role in his family's businesses. He held meetings with executives, challenging them to adopt more ethical policies and reconsider past decisions. His voice, once used only to drive profits, now pushed for accountability and compassion. One crisp Saturday morning, as sunlight spilled into the living room, Sarah sat at the dining table, reviewing a stack of papers. They were rental applications for apartments, each one a potential new beginning. Michael entered the room, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Anything promising?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. Sarah smiled faintly. "A few places look good. Affordable, close to the kids' school. I'll visit them next week." Michael pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You're really doing it," he said, his tone filled with quiet admiration. She looked at him, her smile growing. "I am, and I couldn't have done it without your help." Michael shook his head. "You did this, Sarah. I just gave you the tools. You made it happen." Sarah's gaze softened. "Thank you, Michael, for believing in me, and for giving my kids a chance at a better life." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "You've given me something too, a reason to do better, to be better." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the air between them no longer heavy with uncertainty, but light with the promise of new beginnings. That afternoon, Michael surprised the children with a trip to the nearby park. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves crunched underfoot as they raced toward the playground. Max followed close behind, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. "Come on, Max," Liam called, waving a stick in the air. Max barked enthusiastically, bounding after him. Michael and Sarah watched from a bench, the sounds of laughter and playful barks filling the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She turned to Michael, her gratitude unspoken but evident in her expression. "You've got a good heart, Michael," she said softly. Michael smiled, his gaze fixed on the children. "I just needed the right people to remind me of that." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the park, it felt like the end of one chapter and the start of another. For Sarah, Liam, Sophie, and even Max, life was finally moving forward. And for Michael, it was a chance to rewrite his own story, not as a man of power, but as a man of purpose. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but together, they had found something rare and precious: hope. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving.